Welcome, my friends, to part 2 of this chapter 5 presentation. Okay, so in this chapter we're looking at physical and cognitive development of the child. So we're looking at childhood. All right, hope you're doing well. This is the nighttime edition. I recorded the first part in the morning. Now it's almost midnight, getting into section 2. All right, I hope you're doing well, and let's get into this. So in terms of memory and language, I want to kind of wrap this up and talk about memory and then talk a little bit about language development, and then we'll do a review of the chapter to kind of get you queued up to approach the next quiz. So in terms of strategies for improving memory, long-term memory depends on learning activities that the individual engages in when learning and remembering information, right? So this idea that like the situation that you were in when you were learning and the situation that you're in when you're trying to remember affects the learning and remembering process, that context matters, right? Guide the child towards elaborating the information they're trying to remember. They're trying to remember something. Well, can you tell me something about it? Or can you tell me the situation where you learned it in there? Help them try to elaborate. Motivate children to remember material by understanding it rather than just memorizing it. So these are like, if you're trying to help a kid remember things better, one thing is help them try to elaborate what they mean, and if they can actually understand it, then the chances of, then it's not just rote memorization, then they're actually remembering something that they know. And this idea of like, when you learn something fully the first time, when you go to study it later, it's a very different process than if you're like relearning it. Repeat and vary the instructional information and link it to other information, right? Because you're almost like consciously making those memory pegs. Embed the memory relevant in language when instructing children, right? Like talking about, and you see this naturally with so many of the things that are taught to children being in rhythmic form, where like it's almost designed in a way that enables memorization, right? And the best example is something like the alphabet, but just this idea of the learning environment, right? And at the end of last presentation, we were talking about Vygotsky and his idea of the zone of proximal development. And it's like, yeah, so there's that piece, but then there's also this aspect of the more meaningful and the more engaging and the more kind of the more relevant, I say the memory relevant language, but you're kind of trying to build the memory cues into the learning process, right? I tell my students at Conestoga all the time that like everything from note taking to attending lectures to watching videos, this is all you're studying. It's all part of the same process of preparing yourself to consume information and be assessed on your ability to do that later. All right, welcome back to part 2. Hope you're doing well. Let's keep going. So one type of memory I want to talk about is this idea of autobiographical memory. So this is like, and if you think about what an autobiography is, right? An autobiography is like a book about, well, your own life. It's like a story you write about your life, a biography you write about yourself. Your autobiographical memory is how we have this developing, this sense of self requires building a story about our life. And it's like, if you were to write your autobiography, where would you start and how would you write it? And that story of your life, your autobiography, can be based on memories of significant events and experiences in our life. So we're going to talk about how there's kind of different parts of memory. And one part of memory is like this narrative story about who you are, right? Which is going to, there's problematic aspects to that, because well, when we get into the teenage years, we'll be looking at like what happens if that story of who we are isn't very positive, and this can get manifested in things like self-esteem and self-concepts and body issues and all kinds of things related to not liking the story that we tell ourselves about ourselves, and a failure to recognize that you're not your story about yourself, you're not your autobiographical memory, you're yourself, and those aren't the exact same thing, even though they're interrelated in some ways. Okay, there's my first weird rant of this one, so it should feel like home. Okay, next slide. So this next idea is called fuzzy trace theory. Okay, so in terms of how memories are represented, so think about how memories are represented, meaning like, okay, well, if it's not like an actual file, your memory, how is it represented, or how is it represented in your brain, and how does it get then represented in your visual cortex or whatever when you think about something that you've seen before? Fuzzy trace theory states that memory is best understood by considering two types of memory representation. Number one, verbatim memory trace, so precise details, and number two, the gist, right? So if it's like if I was like to tell you, okay, you're like, hey Mike, you said once that you like the show Dexter, what's that about? And I'm like, well, basically it's about this guy that's like kind of a murderer, but also is like a cop, and so, or works for the police, and there's this interesting dynamic, and he's constantly trying to get caught, and blah blah blah. It's like I'm kind of giving you the gist of the show, the general kind of idea. And so the idea is that memories exist in both those ways. We have these like general idea memories and then these verbatim memories. So let me just say this again. The verbatim memory trace consists of precise details of information, whereas gist refers to the central idea of the information. When the gist is used, fuzzy traces build up. So fuzzy traces is just this like term that they use, right? We have these traces of memory. Although individuals of all ages extract gist, so that just means like, although people from all ages kind of are focusing also on that kind of general gist, younger children tend to store and retrieve verbatim traces, so like remembering exactly what was said. At some point during the early elementary years, children begin to use the gist more, like the understanding like the kind of the essence of it more. And according to this theory, this contributes to why memory starts to improve and reasoning starts to improve in older children. The argument is that fuzzy traces are more enduring and less likely to be forgotten than verbatim, right? So this, instead of remembering what I'm saying word for word, if you sort of remember the general idea of what I'm talking about, you're more likely to remember that than the word for word. It's kind of interesting concept. Okay, so in terms of, remember we're talking about the school years and childhood, and this work is looking at sort of the key academic related cognitive skills at this stage, and this idea of self-control, inhibition, number two, working memory, and number three, flexibility. Adele Diamond and Kathleen Lee in 2011 at the University of British Columbia highlighted the following dimensions of executive function that they conclude are the most important for 4 to 10-year-olds in terms of cognitive development and school success. The first one they highlight is this idea of self-control and inhibition. Children need to develop self-control that will allow them to concentrate on and persist in learning tasks, to inhibit their tendencies to repeat incorrect responses, and to resist the impulse to do something that they would later regret. Okay, so if we're looking at the factors associated with school success and kind of cognitive performance in childhood, one of the big ones is like, are they able to kind of maintain control and reduce the urge and develop self-control. The second part, working memory. Children need an effective working memory to mentally work with the masses of information that they're going to encounter in school and beyond. So we had talked about before at the end of the last presentation how like working memory is the mental workbench of the mind. And then flexibility. Children need to be flexible in their thinking so as to consider different strategies and perspectives. So if we're looking at kind of, if you had a question about sort of the key academic skill development, what I say here, the aspects of executive functioning, so high-end decision making, most important for 4 to 10-year-olds at school: self-control, working memory, flexibility of thought. So I want to talk about critical and creative thinking. Okay, so the slide says that thinking is manipulating and transforming information in memory. And that's a decent actual definition of the word thinking. But we can but there's two important aspects of thinking, and I want to talk about critical thinking and creative thinking. And critical thinking, that term is kind of meaning different things these days, but I don't mean critical as in complaining. I mean critical as in not just accepting everything, but like actually weighing information and making your own informed decision based on your, like we mentioned earlier, cognitive freedom. I like that picture. It's like with the one mouse saying to the other mouse, for God's sake, why do you think he's being so nice? The cat's like dragging the mouse away in a car. Critical thinking involves thinking reflectively and productively and evaluating evidence. Deep understanding occurs when students are stimulated to rethink previously held ideas. In their view, schools spend too much time getting students to give. In the view of people that push the critical thinking idea. In their view, schools spend too much time getting students to give a single correct answer in an imitative way rather than encouraging them to expand their thinking by coming up with new ideas and by rethinking earlier conclusions. Supporters of critical thinking observe that too often teachers ask students to recite or define or describe or state or list things rather than getting them to analyze or infer or connect or synthesize or critique or create or evaluate or think or rethink. Many successful students complete their assignments, do well on tests, get good grades, yet don't ever really learn how to think critically and deeply. They may think more at a superficial level, staying on the surface of problems rather than stretching their mind and becoming deeply engaged in meaningful thinking. Okay, so if you think about this, if you think of a stream that then diverges into two streams, like kind of forks out, or you can think of the opposite of like two streams that converge into one stream. So this is the idea of like convergent versus divergent, just to kind of explain those terms. Creative thinking is the ability to think in novel and unusual ways and to come up with unique solutions to problems. Thus, intelligence and creativity are not the same thing. This difference was recognized by J.P. Gulford in 1967, who distinguished between this idea of convergent thinking, which produces one correct answer and characterizes the kind of thing that is required on conventional tests of intelligence, and divergent thinking, which produces many different answers to the same question and characterizes creativity. Right, and it's important to recognize that some children will show more creativity in some areas than others, right? Some kids might be very creative on the sports field, but not creative writers, and some kids will be creative writers, and some kids will be creative musically, and some kids will be creative with their art, and some kids will be creative in the games they play. Right, so sometimes convergent thinking is important though. Like if you're trying to learn the list of the presidents of the United States history in order, you're trying to remember all the names in order. It's like, well, there's a right order and an incorrect way of doing it. It's not. But if you're trying to think of like some interesting take on something, or you're trying to write an interesting paper, or you're trying to just be a free thinker, sometimes more divergent thinking is important. And so it's kind of both these things are both involved under this umbrella of creative thinking. Well, divergent's more creative, but they're both like ways of thinking. And J.P. Gulford kind of presents this convergent divergent idea to make the point that creativity and intelligence aren't the same thing. They might be sometimes related, but they're distinct conceptual concepts. So if you think of meta as meaning above, this will help. It's interesting that Zuckerberg just renamed Facebook Meta. Meta also in Hebrew, Hebrew is a feminized and a gendered language, so there's male and female versions, and the meta is the female word associated with death. which is interesting, but meta is also in this context. So oftentimes when you hear people say metamorphize or metacognition or metaverse, right? Something above something else. Metacognitive means thinking about thinking. It's like metacognitive. So if cognitive is thinking, metacognition is thinking about thinking. Many studies classified as metacognitive have focused on meta memory or knowledge about memory. Like how much you know. If I get you to tell me a story and I'm like, okay, well, how accurate do you think that story is? If you had to say that in front of a courtroom, how sure are you that you would be right on all those points about that party that you were at a year ago? And you're like, okay, well, if I'm really being honest, I'm like 80% confident. So that's like, think about with that 80% score that you just hypothetically gave yourself in that made up situation. It's like, you like have a score on how much you think your own memory is probably accurate in that scenario. It's like you're thinking about your own thought. Many studies classified men as metacognitive have focused on meta-memory or knowledge about memory. This includes general knowledge about memory, such as knowledge that recognition tests are easier than recall tests. Right, so it's like easier to pick something out of a list, pick the right answer out of a list of answers than to just think of it without having that prompt. It also encompasses knowledge about one's own memory, such as a student's ability to monitor whether they've studied enough for a test that's coming up next week. So that's sort of like my example I gave before. Conceptualization of metacognition consists of several dimensions of executive function, such as how we do things like planning and self-regulation, right? So think about it, your planning is, part of your ability to plan is your ability to sort of check on your plan and make adjustments and be aware that you have a plan that you're enacting. And part of self-regulation is being able to understand when you're, being too emotional, and it's like thinking about your thinking. And part of mental discipline is being able to think about your thinking and keep it disciplined. Okay, so I told you a little bit about this on a little while ago, how Piaget was working with Binet and Simon. So he was one of Simon's students. This is Binet, the other guy. So Thomas Simon and this guy, whose name is Alfred Binet, worked together to create the original IQ test. And I had been mentioning about how Piaget was like sort of a research student with them, or with Simon, the other guy, and was really interested in the wrong answers. So I had touched on this, but I want to read this to you. In 1904, the French Ministry of Education asked psychologist Alfred Binet to devise a method of identifying children who were unable to learn in school. School officials wanted to reduce crowding by placing students who didn't benefit from regular classroom teaching in special schools. Binet and his student Théophane Simon, Simon and Binet, Simon developed an intelligence test to meet this request. It consisted of 30 questions on topics ranging from the ability of one to touch one's ear to their ability to draw from memory and define abstract concepts. So the ability to touch one's ear, like basically they're judging everything from just ability to basically process information to be able to define abstract topics. So it's quite a range. Binet developed the concept of mental age, an individual's level of mental development relative to others. See it on the screen here represented with MA. So you'll hear this like, oh, this, you still hear people sometimes use this talking about maybe someone had a brain injury or something, and you'd say like they're kind of functioning at the mental age of someone much younger. Again, that's very dated language, but you may have heard someone say something like that. A few years later, in 1912, William Stern created the concept of an intelligence quota based on this idea, sort of, right? So a person's mental age, MA, so this is how we get the score, right? So these guys create this test, and then this idea of an IQ score kind of comes by taking the mental age, dividing it by, so the mental age is, you get your score in the test, divide it by your actual age, and then times 100. Okay, so to give you an example, if somebody's mental age is the same as their chronological age, their IQ would be 100. Okay, so if the mental age is above the chronological, if someone's mental age is the same as their chronological age, their IQ would be 100. So IQ is mental age divided by chronological age times 100. If you want to write that down even in your notes just as an equation, I'll try to say it clear here, that IQ equals mental age divided by chronological age times 100. Therefore, if someone's mental age is the same as their chronological age, it'll equal a percentage IQ of 100. If mental age is above the chronological age, then IQ would be more than 100. If it's below the chronological age, their IQ would be below 100. Okay, so again, I didn't say that the clearest, but it's basically this idea that IQ equals mental age, which is the score on the test, divided by chronological age, which is your actual age, times 100. Okay, so now notice BNET, so that's the guy that we just saw in the last slide, his picture. Stanford's the school, right? So at Stanford, they're doing this IQ, so that's where the two names, the Stanford BNET. So the BNET test has been revised many times to incorporate advances in our understanding of things like intelligence and intelligence testing, like psychometrics. These revisions are called the Stanford BNET tests. So Stanford University is where these revisions are being done. In 2004, the test, which is now called the Stanford BNET 5, was revised to analyze an individual's response in 5 key areas. Okay, so the Stanford BNET 5 is looking at people's response in these 5 areas. Fluid reasoning, right? So the ability to kind of reason fluidly. I just said it backwards, but basically, like, I give you a situation and you have to figure out what would make sense, apply it in an applied way. So it's testing their fluid reasoning, their knowledge, their quantitative reasoning, so like their reasoning around math, their visual spatial reasoning, so like their reasoning around puzzles and stuff like that, and then their working memory. So when someone does a Stanford BNET IQ score or IQ test, Stanford BNET 5, it's measuring those 5 things. Fluid reasoning, this might be a test question, it's measuring these 5 things. Fluid reasoning, knowledge, quantitative reasoning, which means basically the ability to manipulate numbers and understand math. Fourth is visual spatial and working memory. So if it sounded like I said too many there, quantitative reasoning and math. That's the example of quantitative reasoning. By administering the test to large numbers of people of different ages, from preschool through to adulthood, from different backgrounds, researchers have found that scores on the Stanford BNET test approximate a normal distribution, which basically means that most people sort of fall in the middle. A lot of people have IQs of roughly around 100, and then people deviate from there. And that's what a standard deviation means, that hump is basically perfect on both sides, and that the average score is around 100, and then people score above and below it, but in sort of consistent ways. That's what a perfect pie graph would, or a perfect bell curve would look like. You can see why they would even call it a bell curve, because it looks like a bell. It's a normal distribution is another way of saying that, which means like most of them are in the middle and then it sort of tapers out in a normal type of distribution. It's a statistic word, but it kind of makes sense. The majority of scores are falling in the middle of the possible range of scores, with fewer scores appearing near the extreme edges of the range. So then there's Wesler's scale. So with this one, with Wesler scale, what we're looking at is Another set of tests that's used to assess intelligence. So this is another, you can just have this as like another type of intelligence test. And one of the reasons why people sometimes use this, like with kids or whatever, is because of its ability to work. It gives several what they call composite indexes. So that means like scores on these different areas. It assesses like working memory, verbal comprehension, processing speed. These types of indexes, so indexes means all the questions that were related to this, you can kind of index or group those together, would be another way. These type of indexes allow the examiner to quickly identify either areas where the child is strong or weak, right? So if you have all these questions, but they're sort of coded as these three areas, right? Some of the questions are about verbal comprehension. Are you understanding what I'm saying? Some of them are about working memory. So are you able to kind of manipulate information on that mental workbench? And then the third one is about processing speed, like what, just literally like what's your speed doing all of that. These are often timed tests, right? So then maybe you can see, well, okay, well, this kid actually is able to understand, they're able to actually manipulate the information, that it's more a speed issue, or maybe it's, right? So you can kind of see where potential an issue or a learning challenge would be. It's just a little bit more. So if I was to ask you why we would do this, is because, well, sometimes you might be in a scenario where it'd be nice to be able to see, like, is what the person's struggling with more verbal comprehension, working memory, processing. Okay, so it's just a different type of intelligence test. Okay, so Robert Sternberg, I want to just read a little bit from him for a sec. If you could have in your notes this idea that intelligence comes in three forms, and he talks about analytical, creative, and practical. Robert Sternberg developed this triarchic, or just three-part theory of intelligence, which states that intelligence comes in these three forms: analytic intelligence, which refers to the ability to analyze, judge, evaluate, compare, and contrast; creative intelligence, which consists of the ability to create, design, invent, originate, and imagine; and practical intelligence, which involves the ability to use, apply, implement, put into practice. Sternberg says that children with different triactic patterns look different in schools, look different in quotes. Students with high analytic ability tend to be favored in conventional school settings. They often do well under direct instruction, in which the teacher lectures and gives students subjective tests. They are often considered to be smart students who get good grades, do well on traditional tests of intelligence, and later get admitted into competitive university programs. In contrast, children who are high in creative intelligence are often not in the top rung of the class. Many teachers have high expectations about how assignments should be done, and creatively intelligent students may not conform to those expectations. Instead of their giving conformist answers, they may give unique answers for which they may get marked down if they have bad teachers. No teacher wants to discourage creativity, but Sternberg stresses that too often a teacher's desire to increase students' knowledge sometimes unintentionally suppresses their creative thinking. Like children high in creative intelligence, children who are practically intelligent often don't do well in school. However, many of these children do well outside of the classroom walls. They may be excellent with social skills and have excellent common sense. As adults, some of these people become successful managers, entrepreneurs, or politicians in spite of having undistinguished school records. So kids that score as practical tend to struggle with school, but if they can get in the right situation, can have very successful lives. So I like this idea. So this is a guy named Howard Gardner, and you don't necessarily need to know that, but this idea that looking at different types of intelligence, and people have tried to expand this intelligence idea out and say this, that there's different types of intelligence now. None of these scales are as validated as IQ, but it is interesting, and there's definitely something to be said here. And I like how he refers to this instead of just different types of intelligence, that it's almost like useful to view it as frames of mind. According to Gardner, everyone has all of these intelligences to various degrees, and as a result, we prefer to learn and process information in specific ways. People learn best when they can do so in a way that uses their stronger intelligences, he says. Okay, so he kind of classifies this in 8 different ways. If you could have these down, and I'll go through them now. Some of these are going to be a lot easier or a lot more kind of intuitive than others, like verbal intelligence, basically just your ability to process verbal language. That's actually very complex though, like your ability to understand me and my full vocabulary, and then also your ability to not just understand it but then respond in a way that I can understand back. So that whole verbal intelligence, mathematical intelligence, that's probably easy to understand, just basically an ability to understand things at that mathematical quantitative level. Number 3, spatial intelligence. Like, this is something I'm not as good at that my wife's much better than me at, like knowing directions and puzzles and stuff like that, like being able to see things positionally in your head. Body kinesthetic, being able to like manipulate objects, being physically adept, like athletes, musicians tend to score high in this. The 5th one that's connected to this is musical intelligence, right? So people, the basic point is just that people have different kind of skill sets, and their intelligence gets expressed in these different ways. Inter and intrapersonal. So inter meaning like some people are just really skilled at, there's some people that if you were having an awkward situation at some party or something, and maybe you have a friend that if they were there, it's like, oh, they'll take the heat off. They're kind of good in these situations, or they're good with like whatever, socially skilled people. And some of that's at an interpersonal level, and some of that's at an intrapersonal level. Like some people understand themselves better. And then the last one, naturalistic, or somebody that is able to light their own fire and catch fish and prepare the fish, and this knowledge of nature. Okay, so Gardner's idea is that you can almost view these as different frames of mind, expressions of intelligence. So I wanted to make a point too here, because a lot of these intelligence tests, or a lot of these, not intelligence tests specifically, but things like psychoeducational tests, assessments, are used to often classify disabilities. And disabilities isn't low intelligence. If somebody has too low of an intelligence score, that actually disqualifies from being considered some of these disabilities. And the average child with a disability actually is often of normal or of higher intelligence. So that's a really interesting point to stress. A lot of people that have disabilities, learning disabilities, struggle in multiple areas. Right, and can have difficulties that aren't necessarily attributed to any of their specifically diagnosed issues. Okay, I'll just give a few examples here. For example, dyslexia is one example of a learning disability that's categorized as individuals who have this severe impairment in their ability to read and spell. There's autism spectrum disorder, which ranges from more severe disorders called autistic disorder to milder things called Asperger's. And I've touched on this topic a little bit, and we will at different times. ASD are characterized by problems in social interactions, problems with verbal and nonverbal communication, and repetitive behaviors. Children with these disorders may also show atypical responses to sensory experiences. ASDs or people that have autism spectrum disorder, can be detected in children as young as 1 to 3 years of age. But it's important to stress here that each individual we're talking about, this can manifest in very different ways in terms of degree of impairment, right? So some people that are high functioning with Asperger's can be living very normal lives and successfully, and some people that have more severe forms of autism need almost constant support. things like ADHD too. Depending on the characteristics of children with ADHD display, they can be diagnosed as ADHD primarily inattention, or ADHD with predominantly, I meant to say inattention, or predominantly hyperactivity. So it's like people can get diagnosed with ADHD, but the main issue is like their attention, or ADHD and the main issue is their hyperactivity, or ADHD with both inattention and hyperactivity a problem. Sometimes you hear people refer to it as just ADD, where it's without that hyperactivity piece. The majority of children who are diagnosed with ADHD fall into that third category of both inattention and hyperactivity or impulsivity. And those things tend to go together. It's more like you're more likely to be impulsive if your attention is low. Okay, so I'll just put this slide up for a sec because I sort of read my note for it on the last slide, but just this idea we went over dyslexia, or this severe impairment in reading and spelling, autism spectrum disorder, and I just talked about that range from autism to Asperger's, and that's why the word spectrum, meaning this, like, that it's just kind of a recognition and a respect for the fact that two people could have autism and have incredibly different experiences. And then the last one I talked about was ADHD, and this attention deficit hyperactivity disorder that can manifest in a variety of ways also. And people that have ADHD, it should be noted, can be highly successful politically, not politically, I meant to say professionally and academically. And politically too, I don't know. That was just a tongue twist. So the development of brain imaging techniques is leading to a better understanding of ADHD. One study revealed that peak thickness of the cerebral cortex occurred in about 3 years later, so around 10 and a half, in children with ADHD than in children without ADHD, where it peaks around 7 and a half. So think about that. The thickness of the cerebral cortex gets that peak thickness almost 3 years later in kids diagnosed with ADHD. This delay is more prominent in the prefrontal region of the brain, especially important in attention and planning. Another study found delays in development of the brain's frontal lobe amongst children with ADHD, which is likely due to a delayed or decreased myelination. Researchers are also exploring the roles that various neurotransmitters such as serotonin and dopamine play in ADHD. It's been found that dopamine transporter, this gene called gene DAT1, is involved in decreasing cortical thickness in the prefrontal cortex of kids with ADHD. Right, so there's a genetic component. So in addition to any potential medication or a behavioral intervention a child might get as support, and obviously with consultation from a doctor, I wanted to add this point that, like, there's actually a lot of research on effective treatments for ADHD, and especially around things like neurofeedback, mindfulness, and exercise. That's why I have the martial art. My personal belief is that martial arts, especially if you're talking about young boys, although it's relevant for girls too, lots of girls do martial arts. Especially the traditional martial arts seem to be really good for kids with ADHD. There's actually quite a bit of research on that. When I mean traditional martial arts, I'm meaning like karate, kung fu, taekwondo, jiu-jitsu, judo, the ones that have that kind of culture of respect and discipline associated with them. Neurofeedback is like, you probably have heard of mindfulness, you obviously know what exercise means. Neurofeedback was this idea of like when people would wear like a bracelet that had their heart rate, and then when they were getting upset, they could slow their breathing and see the actual numbers on their watch change and see how this is what neurofeedback, or like biofeedback sometimes it's called, but it's like learning the connection here between your neurological response and your biological Neurofeedback trains individuals to become more aware of their physiological, biological responses so they can gain better control over their brain's prefrontal cortex, right? So basically so that they can calm themselves, reduce their impulsiveness. All right, so again, my recommendation for parents that have kids with ADHD is, well, my personal recommendation is martial arts for sure. Sports in general, but martial arts specifically. Okay, so the last little bit of this presentation, I want to switch a little bit and tell you that there is a WUG. And then now there's another WUG, and there's two of them. And so what would you call that? Two WUGs? And like, so this is this WUG's idea is like, can I say that to you and kind of almost get you to say WUGs? It's like usually if I was to present this in a class, I would like ask a student this and ask them to finish the sentence. And it's like you've never heard the word WUG before, but you already know that if there's two of them, it'd be WUGs, right? There'd be an S at the end, and it's like that's an example of a rule that you've learned. So I want to talk about these words here, phonology and morphology. Phonology, or the root phonology, refers to the sound system of language, including the sounds used and how they may be combined. Let me back up for a sec, I missed a point. Toddlers move quickly from producing two-word utterances to creating 3, 4, 5-word combinations. Between the ages of 2 and 3, they begin to transition from saying simple sentences that expressed a single proposition, like, I want this, to saying more complex sentences. Phonology refers to the sound system of language, including the sounds. So the phonemes are like the k, ch, k, all like the pieces of sounds that are eventually going to make words. During the preschool years, most children gradually become more sensitive to the sounds the sounds of spoken word, and incredibly capable of producing all the sounds of their own language. By their 3rd birthday, they can produce all the vowel sounds and most of the consonant sounds. By the time children move beyond two-word utterances, they start to demonstrate a knowledge of morph and see, like, taking WUGs and adding the S to it to make it WUGs when it's plural. You're morphing it. You're taking the first word and changing it so it works in a different context. Morphology refers to the units of meaning involved in a word's formation. Children begin using the plural and possessive forms of nouns such as dogs and dogs. So one with just dogs with an S and one with dogs with an apostrophe S. They put the appropriate endings of verbs. They use prepositions or in or on, and articles like a or the. So they're starting to kind of position words, and we're getting towards almost sentences. Some of the best evidence for change in children's use of morphological rules occurs in the overgeneralization of the rules. Right? When a preschool kid goes to talk about how they have 1 foot or 2 foots instead of feet, right? And it's like everyone can understand. They said they pluralized in a way that's normal, but that's actually wrong in that scenario because of the specifics of English. It's like no one's going to be like, why would that kid have said 2 foots? It's wrong, but it's illogical. Or instead of saying I went somewhere, I goaded there. Right, so it's spelled like G-O-E-D, goad. We don't really say that, but it would morphologically make sense for us to say that. In Jean Berco's 1958 study, young children were much better than chance at finishing things like this. What makes Berco's study impressive is that most of the words were made up for the experiment. So this is the example of the WUGs. Thus, the words the children said, like wugs, couldn't be based on remembering anything, right? So if I get, this is a wug, now there's two wugs. This is a wug, now there's two. What do you call them? And you say wugs. It's like, I can be pretty sure that before today you hadn't heard the term wugs before because it's made up. So it can't be, that answer can't be coming from memory. It has to be coming from a rule application. The fact that they can make plurals or past tenses of words they had not heard before was proof that they knew morphological rules. Okay, so let's just get a few more words in here. We're getting close to the end. So when we're talking about language development, there's the syntax, which is the way that the words are combined to form acceptable phrases and sentences. Okay, so preschool children also learn to apply the rules of syntax. Children begin slowly showing a growing mastery of the complex rules for how words should be ordered. Right, so syntax is like we're moving from, if you look at that picture, from phonetics to phonology to morphology to the syntax, how their actual words and phrases and sentences are starting to be built. This is like the rules underpinning language that you've learned so deeply that it almost takes a second to put words back to it because you've just incorporated it so deeply as your spoken fluent language. Being able to do all this is basically what we call being fluent. Semantics means like sort of what the words mean. The aspect of language that refers to the meaning of words and sentences also characterizes early childhood. Vocabulary development is dramatic. Some experts have concluded that between 18 and 6 years of age, a child learns on average of about one word every waking hour, and by the time they enter grade 1, it's estimated that a child knows about 14,000 words. Okay, so the semantics is like the understanding of what those words mean. And then pragmatics is when it's appropriate to use different words, right? So it's sort of like once all these things have been mastered, we would say, well, that these are all the steps of language development. Now we would call the person fluent. Okay, so I have here 6 key principles of vocabulary development. So if you're trying to help kids develop their vocabulary, right? Number 1, the kids will learn the words that they hear the most often, and it's like kind of understanding the functional system of the brain. The things that it's exposed to the most are going to be deemed as important and remembered. Children also learn better from things and events that interest them, because they're probably paying attention more. Children learn words best in responsive interactive context, right? When they're involved rather than when they're just sitting back passively hearing things. They learn more in scenarios where the context of the learning is meaningful, where it feels like it matters. When they're given clear information about what a word means, right? Where an effort is made to make sure that they're understanding the words and they're not just being spoken over. And when they're taught, they learn best when things like grammar and vocabulary are considered, that when that's kind of considered in the learning process. Yeah, grammar is an interesting addition to it, right? Because that's like, well, it's the complexity of language. It's in some ways the most complex thing we do. How do we make these sounds that are clearly communicated in these highly abstract, sophisticated messaging signals? The process of categorizing becomes easier so knowing the difference between different words and stuff becomes easier as the children increase their vocabulary. Children's vocabulary increases from an average of about 14,000 words at age 6 to about 40,000 words by age 11. These advances in vocabulary and grammar during the elementary school years are accompanied by the development of something called metalinguistic awareness. knowledge about language, not just knowing language, knowing about the language, so that meta, or that above. Knowledge about language, such as knowing what a proposition is, or a preposition is, or being able to discuss the sound of a language. Metalinguistic awareness allows children to think about their language, understand what words are, and even define them. It improves considerably during the elementary school years. Defining words becomes a regular part of the classroom discourse as children increase their knowledge of syntax as they study and talk about the components of subjects, such as subjects and verbs. Right, so the kids are building this fluency, this deep engagement with this system of meaning called language. Okay, before learning to read, children learn to use language to talk about things that aren't present. They learn what a word is, and they learn to recognize sounds and talk about them. I'm going to just read for a sec here. Children who begin elementary school with a robust vocabulary have an advantage when it comes to learning to read. And there's sort of two approaches, and one is kind of hold language, or like trying to push the full words and get them to catch up. And one is phonetics, or focusing on the sounds and sounding it out, and it's kind of a combo. There's benefits of both. In some whole language classes, beginning readers are taught to recognize whole words or even entire sentences and use the context of what they're reading to guess out the meaning of the words. Reading materials that support whole language reading approaches are whole and meaningful. That is, the children are given material in its complete form, such as stories and poems, so that they learn to understand language's communicative function. Reading is connected with listening and writing skills. In contrast, a phonetics approach, or sorry, I meant to say a phonics approach. If you remember as a kid, Hooked on Phonics was like a program to catch people up if they weren't good at reading. Phonics, sounding it out, emphasizes that reading instructions should teach basic rules for translating written symbols into sounds. Early phonics-centered reading instructions should be involve simplified materials. Only after children learn to corresponding rules that relate spoken phonemes to the alphabet letters that are used to represent them should they be given more complex reading materials such as books and poems. Basically, that like kids should learn the sounds first, then the words, then worry about things like sentences and actually books and poems. Research suggests that children can benefit from both approaches, but instruction in phonetics needs to be emphasized. Right? Or sorry, I keep saying phonetics. Phonics. Phonics needs to be emphasized. An increasing number of experts in the field of reading now conclude that direct instruction in phonics is a key aspect to learning to read. Beyond the phonics whole language issue in learning to read, becoming a good reader includes learning to read fluently. Many beginning and poor readers don't recognize words automatically. Right? So basically, fluid reading means that as soon as you see the word, you just read it. You're not consciously, actively trying to figure it out. Many beginning or poor readers do not recognize words automatically. Their process capacity is consumed by the demand of word recognition, so they have less comprehension of grouping of words or phrases or sentences. As their processing of words and passages becomes more automatic, it's said that their reading becomes more fluent. Metacognitive strategies such as learning to monitor one's reading progress, getting the gist of what's being read, and summarizing are all important in becoming a good reader. Alright, my friends, we made it through chapter 5. I hope you're doing well. It's like 1:10 in the morning here, so I'm going to hit you with these rapid fire final points and then call it a night. Okay, so again, you have these in your notes, but we're just going to kind of do a review here. As children grow, they lose their top-heavy appearance. Individual differences in growth are influenced by ethnic origin and nutrition. Okay, so there are genetic and nurture or nutrition-based differences. Right, like obviously, like a child's growth is going to be heavily impaired if they don't have the nutrients to grow properly, and if kids are in nutrient-rich environments, that's obviously going to foster more healthy growth. Brain development includes myelination, synaptic pruning, and an increase in more localized activity. Development in the prefrontal cortex is especially critical for planning and other aspects of executive function. Individual differences in brain development are related to parenting quality and poverty. We sort of touched on that with like things like attachment and poverty. That's sort of related to the above point about nutrition, especially in that scenario. And there's like, that's actually a hugely loaded sentence, that there's a lot of things related to how poverty affects brain development, but mainly in areas like nutrition is one big one. Number 3, gross and fine motor skills improve dramatically during childhood. Okay, so we see this big change in sort of the physical skill, quote unquote, you can call it sort of athleticism of the kid, or their ability to use tools, their ability to use their hands to manipulate their environment. Exercise and play are essential for optimal physical, cognitive, and social development. Right? They're learning their world. According to Piaget, in the pre-operational stage, children cannot yet perform operation. It's like we talked about conservation as an example of that. Pre-operational children can be characterized by egocentrism, animism, or like thinking that things that are not alive are alive, and a lack of understanding of conservation. The later is caused by this centration, or thinking of yourself as the center, this lack of reversibility, like that what just got poured in that big cup, you could just pour it right back in the small cup and then they'd be equal. Right? Reversibility, not being able to do that operation, being pre-operational. By age 7, children enter in this concrete operational stage, which we'll get into more next time, where they can start to solve that problem and demonstrate serration and transitivity, or basically we're going to talk about this, what serial transitivity is, more next week. That won't be on the test because that's going to be about concrete operational stage. Okay, Vygotsky's theory represents a social constructivist approach to development. Vygotsky argues that it's important to discover the child's zone of proximal development. So we talked a lot today about this ZPD idea to improve a child's learning. Information processing theories focus on how attention, executive function, and memory change across childhood. Increases in knowledge and the use of strategy contribute to improved performance across childhood. Cognitive development has implications for daily life, including autobiographical memory, eyewitness testimony, thinking about the future, ideas around theory of mind, critical thinking, creative thinking, metacognition. All these things also improve during childhood. All right, and the last point, researchers have yet to agree on the best definition of intelligence. Children belonging to various special populations, such as children with autism spectrum disorder or special learning disability, or different learning disabilities, may require special education. The increases in accessibility in terms of education and the ability of technology to support different kinds of learning challenges is really sort of changing the game a lot for kids in these areas. And again, it's important to note that kids with learning disabilities often have average to high-end IQ. Okay, four more points, we're almost there. Number 12, young children increase, you guys are like, Mike, 15 key points, can't you? All right, I'll try to be a little more concise next presentation. Young children increase their grasp of language rule systems. In terms of phonology, children become more sensitive to the sounds of spoken language. Burko's, that idea of the WUGs. Classical study demonstrates that young children understand morphological rules. 13. Preschool children learn and apply the rules of syntax, which involve how words should be ordered. In terms of semantics, vocabulary development increases dramatically in early childhood. 14. Young children's conversational styles improve in childhood. Right? They're becoming more fluent. Early precursors of literacy and academic success develop in this early childhood period. Right? So this matters because this is sort of setting the pattern and the foundation for what's coming later. All right, so now you're ready to do this next quiz. I hope you're doing awesome, and I hope that was an okay presentation. I'm gonna wrap up. This looks like it's gonna be right about an hour, and yeah, again, now this is Monday night late. Tomorrow, this will all be out, and yeah, thanks again for being a great class. I am still chipping away through those giants of psychology. I apologize for the delay with assignments. It's related to just, I made that video just about how I was kind of out of it for a few days, but I'm back, and tomorrow I hope to get another good marking session in, so hopefully you'll hear from me soon on that. And then the next presentation will be coming out relatively soon too, like end of the week or on the weekend. Alright, so I'll be in touch. Thanks for watching, and being such cool students. Cheers.